This is AM Agenda. Thanks for your company this morning. With me now, Labor MP Nick Champion and Liberal frontbencher Senator Mitch Fifield. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good morning.
The mining tax set to pass the Senate, Nick, after it's taken a while, hasn't it? Millions of dollars spent on both sides of the debate. It brought down a Prime Minister in part. Finally today, it must be a relief for Labor to have this through.
Well, look, it's the most important thing is it's going to deliver benefits to the Australian people rather than having a whole raft of wealth sort of amongst a privileged few held in sort of, perpetuity by them for their interests. We're going to have it spread amongst the Australian people, amongst small business, amongst rural and regional communities in the form of infrastructure, and most importantly, amongst workers through their superannuation. So it's a relief to the government, obviously, and a good reform, another reform, along with the structural separation of Telstra and carbon and a whole lot of other things that we're doing for the country's future. But most importantly, it's a good reform for the Australian people.
It is a tough position for the coalition to be in part because of the tax cuts for small business and for larger companies for that matter, which you're going to block as part of this revenue measure.
Well, it's not difficult for us at all, Kieran. This government are systematically going about removing every competitive advantage Australia has. We know that they're doing that with the carbon tax. Cheap energy is one of our great advantages. They're doing that with the mining industry, which is fortunately going great guns, employing people, yet the government is determined to try and, punch them in the solar plexus. So we have no difficulty at all opposing the mining tax.
What do you do then with the two-speed economy? Because obviously the mining taxes, the mining industry is doing so well, and the Henry Review did say that a profits-based tax was needed. What would you do to level out the two speeds?
Well, see, that's the Labor approach, is the way to address the two-speed economy in Labor's book is you smash that part of the Australian economy which is actually going well. What you want to do is you want to try and bring up those other sectors of the economy, and you don't do that by hitting the mining industry with a mining tax, and you don't help bring up those other sectors by hitting them with a carbon tax. It's a very perverse approach. And here, this may be very inside the beltway, but today we're going to see on about the 10th or the 11th sitting day of the year, the government bring down the guillotine in the Senate on the carbon tax debate. There are still important questions that need to be answered. The government haven't come clean with their full revenue assumptions. The government haven't come clean with their costings on the ancillary programs related to the carbon tax, and they still haven't come clean as to whether their costings include a full accounting of the royalty compensation which they've promised.
Well, I suppose that does dilute the government's argument in the sense that you'd be saying, OK, we're providing a tax cut for small business, but then they do have that additional impost through the carbon price, so it does confuse your argument, as Senator Fifield has pointed out.
Not so much about the sort of public arguments, I suppose. It's really the long-term test for the country, Kieran, and if the long-term test for the country is that we're providing benefits to small business when they're under pressure, we're providing benefits to companies when they're under pressure because of the currency, and the currency is rising because of commodity prices and because of the enhanced profitability of the mineral sector. The mineral sector doesn't actually employ that many people compared to the other areas of the economy like manufacturing, and so what we're doing is doing something that's going to show up not in next week's papers, but I think down the track 5, 10, 20 years, and there's no doubt in my mind that the coalition will end up keeping this tax, because to try and embark on a rollback, that is to unscramble the egg, will be a disaster for the coalition, and most importantly it'll be a disaster for the country.
It will be a tough argument to make, though, in terms of the rollback. We saw that with Kim Beazley with the GST. Once it's in place, do you concede that it's more difficult to get rid of, as much as you do think it is it's hampering the fast lane of the economy, as you argue?
Well, you're right, Kieran. It will take work to undo some of the bad things that Labor have done, whether it be the MRRT.
But that would be also to increase the tax rate for small business. That wouldn't go down too well.
Well, Kieran, we've made it clear that we will take to the next election a tax plan, and part of that will be personal income tax cuts, modest, but also a company tax cut, which we will fund from savings. Okay. These guys are pretending that the mining tax is going to be fully funding their tax cuts,
yeah.
But dollars are fungible. They're increasing tax to cut tax. If you're cutting a tax by increasing other taxes, as we've said time and again, and we'll continue to say, it's a con.
What about the carbon tax? The argument has been that the price will help drive innovation towards clean energy. We're seeing a report today by the Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Their projection is that the price worldwide could be $5 per tonne of carbon by 2020. That won't drive much at all.
Kieran, I find this really interesting. Last year we were told, or even last week we were told there were going to be no prices on carbon. We were acting alone, and now today we find that we're actually not acting alone, and there is going to be a worldwide carbon price. Now you can argue and debate about what the level is, and there's another report which says countries like England have got an effective carbon price of $50 a tonne. So the point about it is, last year we were told there was no, we were acting all alone. Australia was out there on the very fringe. This year we were told, there is actually going to be a worldwide carbon price, and we know from other reports that we're a carbon-intensive economy, and we're about 16th out of the G20 in terms of carbon efficiency.
Well, that's Nick's referring to this other report today. There are a couple around. This is the one by GE and the Climate Institute that has Australia 16th in the G20 for being prepared to deal with a low-carbon economy. So we've got a fair bit of work ahead of us.
Kieran, I'll come to that, but just firstly to respond to Nick's points, what we have said is that Australia should not act alone. And when we talk about acting alone, we mean in the absence of major countries such as the United States. The United States is not going to have a carbon tax. The United States is not. The United States is not going to have an economy-wide emissions trading system. California does not. The United States make. So that's the first point. But we're copying it. But we're copying it both ways. Not only are we putting ourselves at a competitive disadvantage with major countries such as the United States who will not have an ETS or a carbon tax, we're also putting ourselves at a disadvantage with those countries that do, because as we're seeing increasing evidence, it's highly likely that those nations which do have a carbon tax, which are part of a global trade, will have a carbon tax which is significantly lower than ours. So competitive disadvantage with those countries that don't have a carbon tax and with those that do.
But there will be a floating price after a couple of years anyway, so it's a moot point as well.
And exporters aren't
a floating price in Australia. Yes. So, what are you saying? It's okay that Australia cops a competitive disadvantage for a number of years?
No. But the point is, and Nick can make the point, but it's the free permits that provide that support for industry in the meantime.
Well, Kieran, we will put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage.
Well, that is the point, isn't it?
We will put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage.
That's Mitch's assertion.
Well, you're putting an extra cost on the economy.
And Mitch's assertions, like the coalition's assertions, are slowly running out of steam. Because first, like last year, saying, we're acting alone, and, there's not going to be a worldwide price. And what do these two reports tell you? These two reports tell you there's going to be a carbon price, it's going to be international, countries around the world are acting, and we are not well placed for the future in terms of adapting our economy to a low emissions environment. And California, you talked about California, that doesn't the US make. It's the 8th biggest economy in the world, and Californians have 40% less intensive carbon rate compared to the rest of America. California is moving towards the future. You want to be where Texas is. Belching out pollution.
There's an important point here. All of the Treasury modelling on compensation and all the other elements of the carbon tax is based on a price which is much, much higher than the report today indicates is likely to be the case. So, okay, if there's going to be a floating price, if it's not going to be as you say, then Treasury need to redo their compensation figures on the basis of a different assumed carbon price.
You pick and choose Treasury modelling a fair bit. The coalition, picks and chooses when it wants it.
Let's look at the pairing issue for Craig Thomson. Apparently, he's issued a doctor's certificate to the opposition showing that he is unwell, but he hasn't been granted a pair. Where does this end? Because surely coalition MPs will need a pair in a similar circumstance to be absent from Parliament. Essentially, for those that aren't aware, it's the granting permission to be outside of Parliament.
Kieran, I'm the manager of opposition business in the Senate, and I will be the last person to get involved in House pairing arrangements. It's entirely a matter for our House whips. They operate on the basis of common sense, and I'm sure that they'll do that.
Nick Champion?
Well, it sounds to me like you know, they're trying to step away from their position, and that's because having been probed by the doctors, he now has to face being probed by, you know, Warren Inch and Christopher Pyne and people like that. I mean, playing doctor, strapping on the rubber gloves and getting out the stethoscope and the ear thing.
Stop.
You know, well, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and we know it's ridiculous, and we know you're going to step back. We know that it's all part of a media strategy to put Craig back in the media. It's ridiculous. It's unedifying. It's partisan. It's pretty appalling, and you should just back down and give the guy a pair. Be decent, just for once in your lives.
That's all for AIM Agenda.
I'm not going to eat my breakfast after that, Nick.
Senator Fifield, Nick Champion. On that note, appreciate it. Thanks all for your time this morning. And that's all for AIM Agenda. Thank you for your company. We'll see you next time.